Hello and welcome. I'm Connie Wray, and I am excited to be the moderator once again for a very special episode of Talk It Out Tuesday, creating change between law enforcement and the community. In this episode of Talk It Out Tuesday, we will continue the powerful and important discussion regarding social injustice, law enforcement, and the issues that have been related to policing. This episode will also have a very special focus on the death of George Floyd, how this has impacted our community, our country, and where we are now because of that. We're going to discuss the recent protests right here in the state of Nevada and across the country. We're also going to look at what is being done in our state to create lasting change between the police and the community, as well as tackling the racial divide and the issue of systemic racism. To do so, we are so honored to have with us today the Nevada Attorney General, Aaron Ford, and as always, Crisis Support Services Executive Director, who is at the helm each and every day, Rachelle Pellissier. To both of you, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Connie.
Attorney General, I'd like to, first of all, thank you again. I know you're very busy, and we greatly appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today. We all recently saw a press conference that you gave a few weeks ago, and you commented on your role as Nevada's top law enforcement officer. And at the same time, you were very open and honest about what it has been like for you as a Black man in America. Why is it so important for you to have these very candid conversations with the citizens of the state of Nevada?
First, let me say thank you so much, Connie, for allowing me to be on Talk It Out Tuesdays. I think this is a very important part of the conversation that I've said before should be near an end. The time for conversing, frankly, should probably be over by now. We should be actually seeing the implementation of actual policies, procedures, and practices and laws and the enforcement of those that helped to improve relationships between law enforcement and the communities that they serve. But alas, we're not there yet. And so these conversations remain important. And it's important that these conversations are candid and that they're candid about injustice and systemic racism, as you've indicated. And I appreciate you highlighting and mentioning the fact that this is a systemic issue. It's not simply about training cops or police reform. It's a systemic issue, and maybe we'll talk about that a little bit more. And it's beyond the criminal justice system. It's well beyond that. But it's a conversation that's important about injustice and systemic racism that in the African American community has faced for generations. Listen, some people still want to argue that this doesn't exist. And you know, they deny the actual existence of it because they are potentially ignorant to the fact that it does exist. The importance of conversations to remove ignorance as an excuse. And I don't use ignorance in a pejorative term. I use it as true, actually, in this true definition of not knowing something exists. And so when we talk about this and we express and explain our backgrounds and our experiences, then folks no longer can claim ignorance as an excuse. And we move from ignorance to intentionality. When we see offensive things happening in our communities, we know that people aren't doing it because they don't know. They're doing it notwithstanding the fact that they do know. And these conversations don't just start in my office. They don't start just in the Capitol, or they don't start just in Talk It Out Tuesdays. These conversations start at home with our families and with our friends. And it starts by teaching our children not to hate people based on the color of their skin, or to stereotype them, or to assume things about them that they have maybe assumed and stereotyped over the course of years. And I close the initial part of this conversation by saying that I've had to have too many conversations with my 3 sons and nephew that I've raised, and my wife and I've raised. As a parent to these 4 Black boys, we've had to teach justice and love and respect to them, as all parents do. But we've had to have an ever-evolving conversation that many people in this country don't have to have. And it hurts me as a Black father and as a Black man when my son, as early as kindergarten, is told that he can't sit at a table with white children because he's Black. And I have to explain to him as early as 5 years old what this conversation is about. Again, it starts at home. It continues right here. And I'm honored to be here to have the conversation.
Thanks, Attorney General Ford. I look at this question and it seems like we tend to be an all or nothing society. All police are bad, we should defund them. all Black Lives Matter people are bad and riot. Life really is a balancing act that we are all a part of. And it's not all or nothing, because we at Crisis Support Services of Nevada get all of the calls from law enforcement and from people of color who have lived with racism all of their lives and have dealt with generational racism that has historic value and does affect us. And that's why it's such a beautiful balancing act for you as our top law enforcement official in Nevada, and also a man of color who is balancing, you know, both parts and all the parts in between of what's going on in Nevada and in our world. So that balancing act for you and for all of us is hard, and feels so good to me to have you at the helm to help us talk about what that balance looks like.
Well, I appreciate it. And frankly, I embrace the opportunity here. I recognize that as a top law enforcement officer in the state and as a Black man, I hold a unique position of being able to talk about that intersection. To be sure, I'm not a police officer, have never been, and I don't claim to be a police officer. But I listen to them when they say that they have a job that challenges their lives every day. I believe it, which is the reason why, for example, when I was in the state Senate, I supported my law enforcement officers by voting to give them, for example, health insurance that had presumptions related to the dangers of their job, that provided for their ability to protect their pensions, that provided for an enhanced penalty when someone actually targets a law enforcement officer because he or she is a law enforcement officer. So I have a lot of respect for our law enforcement officers, but I also have an understanding that people have to be held accountable. And the truth of the matter is, organizations are made of people, and people are fallible, and people are also very complex. And so this notion of saying that it's all or none is too simplistic. It's easy to do because we all look for black and white and forget about the gray oftentimes. But you're absolutely right. It is not an all or nothing circumstance. And in fact, in my estimation and the estimation of most folks who look at these situations, it's 95%, 98, 99% of law enforcement are all good. There are bad apples who are cancers, if you will. And you know what happens to the body if a cancer isn't eradicated? It spreads throughout the entire body. And so we have to eradicate this cancer that is, that are the few bad apples, if you will. But we do have to avoid this notion of trying to categorize all law enforcement as being bad. And in that instance, words matter. And the way that we talk about this matters. Not only does it matter what I say, it matters what people hear and what they take away from it. I mean, don't ignore me when I say I'm not painting a broad brush. Acknowledge me when I say that I am, however, expressing to you not something that I heard, but something, frankly, that I actually know from personal experience about a few of the bad apples, right? And so let's focus on the commonalities, which are that, for example, the good police officers don't want bad police officers on the force any more than anyone else does. So let's focus on trying to find policies that help to root out those who are sullying the name of our police officers.
You mentioned that there are officers that see what's going wrong themselves, and they need a better system to be able to report the injustices that they see. And I would say, Attorney General Ford, you have started your justice and injustice panel discussions, and I'm assuming that those conversations have happened. How can we have a more transparent ability if we see a cop doing something that is wrong and we are another officer? How can we report that? During these panels, what are you trying to accomplish with these discussions?
I've been holding what I call a justice and injustice forum since the Sunday after the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. I've had varying guests on these panels. The very first guests that I had were the sheriffs from Washoe County, Clark County, an NAACP rep, an activist from Reno, and a church clergy member from Southern Nevada to talk about not just the conversation, but the actual tangible outcome that we could see in terms of changes to improve relations. Since then, I've had other law enforcement officers on to talk about it from a union perspective, from a management perspective. I've had civil rights organizations engaged. I've had legislators engaged to talk about legislation that can pass. And the point is, again, to move beyond the conversation, again, because conversing should be near done, and to see what has been done or will be done soon in the aftermath of these killings. And I'm proud to say that legislators, for example, are going to be, in my estimation or in my understanding, acting on some of those, even during the special session, looking to help create some accountability measures, but also to allow people to have a better understanding of law enforcement, but also to have a better trust in law enforcement, which is ultimately the bottom line. Law enforcement and communities have to have a level of trust between one another. And I mean trust going both ways, such that the relationships can improve. And I think that one of the ways it improves, to your point, Connie, about being able to report or share instances, is this duty to intervene that exists in some police departments, but not others. But in Reno, for example, Chief Soto said immediately after George Floyd, he told his people to draft up a policy about a duty to intervene that a cop will have vis-a-vis another cop if they see that other cop engaging in inappropriate activities with a resident. That sounds like common sense. I mean, in fact, we know it's common sense because it's a motto now that the cops say to us: when you see something, say something. In other words, go snitch. When and there's always this pushback around that. It's also applicable in the law enforcement arena. If you see something, say something. And if you don't, there needs to be a repercussion associated with that is transparent and that the public knows exists, so that the trust can again be emboldened as between communities and law enforcement.
We've got to get to a place when the public sees an injustice, they're able to say something also, and they're listened to, and they're not categorized as a troublemaker or anything else. So I think that as we talk about it going both ways, I really think it's important that we both listen and report both ways to make this systemic change that we need to make.
That's a great point. Law enforcement allowing or recognizing that people have the right, the First Amendment right, to actually petition government and to complain about things that they see that when things are going wrong. And to be sure, sometimes the community can be wrong on their perception, and that communication is important back and forth. And speaking back to something you said a minute ago about lumping everybody into either good or bad, one of the things that I'm proud of seeing is that the media, for example, as well as law enforcement, hasn't lumped into the same category the Black Lives Matter protesters, for example, with the looters. There is a distinction between the two, and folks know it. I mean, the media is saying the peaceful protesters of the Black Lives Matter movement, began and ended at this time, and then came the looters, right? And I'm kind of paraphrasing, but at the end of the day, we recognize that there's an important distinction there. Here is a very personal example of how I've seen people lump people into categories. As an African-American male, I've heard too many times before, and generally speaking, I've been one of the only African-Americans in a context, whether it's in my university classroom at Texas A&M University or at the Ohio State University or in whatever I'm doing, where I'll hear someone say, and they mean it as a compliment, "You're different. You're not like the rest of them. You're an exception." And they're talking about me vis-a-vis other African Americans, and particularly other African American men. And again, they think, they mean it as a compliment, but I receive it for what it actually is, which is an assumption that must be underlying that, which is others who look like me are somehow different in a negative sense. And the importance of personal relationships and understandings and ensuring that you don't categorize or stereotype, as we said in the last context of the conversation, is also important. And being conscious about that and recognizing that that's actually what's happening during those types of exchanges. And so I make it a point to say when I'm told I'm an exception, I say, actually, I'm an example. I'm an example of what happens when people from neighborhoods like mine, or people who look like me, are given true opportunity to succeed, and they capitalize on that opportunity. And so changing the discussion, recognizing when we hear comments that perpetuate problems, that we address those is an important part of this conversation as well.
I have to tell you, Attorney General, I've attended several of the Black Lives Matter rallies here in Reno, and I can honestly say the very first one, I felt compelled to be there more as I needed to do better and I needed to know more and I needed to educate myself. And after my first rally that I attended, I got a phone call from my dad. And he had said to me that he was so proud of me that I went there. And the reason that he was proud is that when the segregation marches were happening in the 60s, there weren't any white people that were there. It was very few that you saw. And he said it just makes him feel like this will be the time we can actually have change, because it made him feel like his daughter was there. He knows friends and family members that are going to these rallies, even in the midst of COVID. To him, it made him believe we could finally have some sort of change. And I believe that for the first time. I know this is difficult and each day is a struggle. And each day I feel like I learn so much, and I have a combination of emotions where I am angry with myself because I feel as though I didn't see things that were right in front of me, but I also see changes. And you mentioned Darren Balaam, our sheriff, who's been on this show with us, and he's talked about changes that they want to implement and changes they have implemented and what they're doing to have open conversations. And his speech that he recently gave to the graduates of law enforcement, they were coming in and telling him about their opportunity that they have right now to make great change and what their whole career is going to look like. I just felt like that was very powerful. And I'm wondering if in these discussions, in these panel discussions that you're having, do you feel that these changes can finally be implemented and that we really will see the change that my father, who has been since the 60s, has seen this and wants nothing more than to have equality for everyone?
First off, let me say thank you for participating in the marches. My sons, I have two sons who are, I have three sons, but one is 19 and one is 27 now. And those two participated in the marches. I did not go. As a top law enforcement officer in the state, I wouldn't violate the 50-person rule, so I wouldn't be there. But I appreciate people exercising that right. Let me say this. The context is different here because we don't have distractions available to us. Sports aren't on TV right now. You can't go to work. You can't go to the bar. You can't go to the club. And so when George Floyd was killed, people saw it in their face every single day. Every time they turned on the television, they could not escape the actuality of this happening. And the reason why I share this with you is because that's a difference. I've experienced this dozens of times, too many times to count, frankly. And I get a headache every time an instance like this happens where a black man is killed at law enforcement's hands, because I have to have, again, a conversation with my son about what the new rule is. And by the way, it's not just about law enforcement killing kids. It's about people, African Americans being killed, and then people not being held accountable, from Trayvon Martin to others, to Ahmaud Arbery. And so talking about not being able to jog in a neighborhood, or not being able to wear a hoodie, or not being able to even go bird watch without having the cops called on you, or conversations that I have with my son. So this isn't new to me. And I don't say this to minimize the experience that you've just had, Connie. What I say is, I'm glad that you've had it and that you are able to recognize that it's occurring, because that is part of what the allies that we need in this struggle have to experience, so that they can, again, speak to remove ignorance, i.e. I never knew, to intentionality, but this time on the positive side, and to try to effect positive change, and then to ensure that people like Sheriff Balaam are the ones who are elected, because those are the ones who are going to institute the change and to oversee the policies and to ensure that they're being enforced. And to elect people like Jason Farris and then Nicole Canizaro. I hate to get political, but the point is, it's those individuals who are going to be implementing right now the changes that people are demanding. And thank goodness that I was elected into this position as Attorney General, because I get to now speak from my position of power, if you will, to power. And I get to talk about this as well, because not everyone would do this. So I feel confident that we'll see some level of change this go around. I am saddened that It took yet another killing of an African-American male at the hands of police before we got to this point, which is why I always put in quotes that I appreciate the opportunity to have the conversation. But if the lack of distraction is what it took for us to ensure that allies noticed it, then that's the silver lining in all of this.
How do we move forward? How do we, and what do we do as an average citizen? I mean, obviously, I'm glad you're in the job you're in, but I'm not the Attorney General. But I want to implement change. How do we go from a proposal to implementing the real change that the three of us, as we sit here and have this deep conversation, I honestly, when we have conversations like this, I feel like we can get there. We have people that want to make that change.
I think we can get there. It's a matter of will, and it's a matter of not being complacent. It's a matter of not having what John Wiley Price in Dallas, when I was a kid, he was a commissioner. He used to say, we have a 7-day memory. Something bad happens in about 7 days, we forget about it and move on to the next thing. And maybe he had more than 7 days. But the point is, we can't forget, and we have to absolutely hold people accountable. And so what's happening now, and this is to your question, Connie, this is what's happening. I think legislatively, we're going to see some changes made to the way chokeholds can be utilized, if at all. We're going to see a request that I have made, which is to give my office the ability to do what we call pattern and practice investigations into police departments when there are allegations of racially discriminatory practices vis-a-vis a particular community. I've also asked to give my office concurrent authority to prosecute certain officer-involved misconduct matters. Maybe it's as limited as shootings, but maybe it's broader. I don't know. We have to look and see how we can figure that out. But aside from legal changes or law changes in the law, we see policies being changed and implemented. But let me be clear. It's not so much the existence of a policy or the law that matters, because a lot of these departments have the policies already in place. It's not even the implementation of those policies. Again, and I referenced this earlier, it is the transparent enforcement of those laws. Here's what happens right now. A black person turns on the TV, he sees on CNN that a black person's been killed at the hands of law enforcement. The first thing most black folks think is, here we go again, and ain't nothing gonna happen. Excuse my colloquialism, but that's exactly the mindset of a lot of us when we see a black person being killed by police officers. That should not be the mindset. The mindset should be, oh boy, let me look back in 6 weeks and know for a fact that an appropriate consequence has been meted out against an individual if in fact that individual violated policy. That's what we want to get to. And how do you get there? You get there by actually enforcing and penalizing folks who violate the policies. And by penalizing, I don't mean necessarily only at the law enforcement department level. When someone gets charged and then they go to court, and if they are acquitted, what does that tell an entire community of folks who are continually seeing this situation of black men being killed, in what appears to be very open and shut cases? I'm not entirely doubting our criminal justice system. I mean, I'm part of it and I agree with it. But I'm telling you that what we have to see from a public perspective and public perception perspective is the actual enforcement of these policies and the meting of justice against those who violate their training.
It's not just law enforcement. It has to be transparent and across the system. We talked about systemic change. We're real good at pointing the finger at law enforcement right now, but that, as you just said, has got to be across the court system, across the entire legal system, that change happens.
And one of the things that I think we're going to see is also a requirement of an additional reporting requirement on arrests, stops, and things of that sort, so we can look at the demographic breakdown. Because here's what we know. We know that the statistics bear out that discretion and reason and benefit of the doubt is not afforded in a non-discriminatory basis at every level of law enforcement. For example, some are arrested when others are not, and that's a police discretion. And some are prosecuted when others are not. And then some are punished by the judge when others are not. And so looking at the disparate breakdown to ascertain, what it is, and then to address it is part of the issue as well. This doesn't happen overnight. And I know this may be a question you're going to ask, Connie, but it's a perfect parlay to the answer to that question. It doesn't happen overnight. It's going to take time. The bus boycott was not the only thing that shepherded in the civil rights movement, and it wasn't a one-day boycott. So recognizing that time is of the essence is important, but also recognizing that time is not something that we can rush when that I shouldn't say that we can't rush, but it's going to take some time to get it done. So, this is part of the conversation, hopefully, again, part of the ending of the conversation, and we'll see some changes in the law and in policies. But the most important thing, in my estimation, is seeing the actual enforcement of those policies, vis-a-vis those who violate practice, training and the policies, and the enforcement of those and the meting of punishment against that.
What are the steps that we should take? I mean, do you think that we should be writing to legislature, our assemblymen? Where can we as a citizen take this type of action? And going back to your comments about systemic racism, I feel like the pandemic has ripped off the Band-Aid and really made us look at what truly systemic racism is. And I bring this up just to give you an example of how it was right in my face and I didn't even truly understand it. My daughter is in a theater group here in town. And when the pandemic hit, they did their play virtually. And what my husband and I noticed is each day they would film their Zoom meetings and then they would put the play together and they put the play on. And when we watched the play, there were two young girls that were part of the cast. One is African American and one was Hispanic. And their internet was constantly glitching. And after the show was over, my husband said, that is systemic racism. Why do those girls not have the same internet? Imagine where they are right now. They're both in school. So that means they're now getting their education online because of COVID-19. How are they getting their education? And I work with several organizations here through the Washoe County School District. My daughter goes to a charter school here. And it's something that my husband and I, it's right in our face and we didn't notice it. How can we make those changes so that we can continue to see those things and do something about it?
Yeah, the smile on my face is not like a smile of joy. It's a smile of kind of like, I'm glad you're saying this out loud, right? I mean, again, it's an acknowledgement. It's a first step. It's part of, maybe it's not the first, it's part of the progress that has to be made, Connie, that you are able to recognize it when you see it. It's funny that you would talk about this in the context of education and Wi-Fi. I mean, I don't know much about Washoe's budget, but Clark County School District just the other day said they're going to need $58 million for distance education for those who can't afford it right now. And those are predominantly Black and brown individuals. That's the Clark County educational system, part of the systemic racism that we have to address. It's not just in criminal justice. It's not just in education. It's also in employment. It's also in housing. It's also in other components of economics. It permeates the entirety of our society, and we have to try to extricate the remnants of the original sin from our daily existence. And part of the way you do that, Connie, is by, first off, as you've indicated, recognizing it. And then seeing what you can do to facilitate some change around it. Recognizing that parity in the way schools are funded is an issue. When you talk about housing, for example, I'm originally from Texas. They have hundreds of school districts down there. And generally speaking, the way school districts are funded are based on property taxes. And so when you have historically experienced redlining in a Black neighborhood where the property values are below market because realtors and banks and appraisers all conspired together to ensure that particular communities couldn't see a sustained increase in value, then it's no wonder that the schools that are supported by those tax funds are lower than other areas that didn't experience redlining. So recognizing it and recognizing that there are remnants that remain right now to this very day is important. And then passing policies that extricate it. Now, here's an example. In the legal arena, or the legislative arena, I was fortunate to be Senate Majority Leader, and we began to try to remove what we saw as the criminalization, the racial decriminalization of marijuana, for example. And now we're trying to extricate the collateral consequences of folks who have convictions of those. And so the Pardons Board just pardoned people, 15,000 people or so, who had misdemeanor convictions of an ounce or less. And now they have to seal their records from that so that they don't have to report that on an out job application, which would otherwise say, no, you can't get this job. So we banned the box on certain applications where you couldn't even ask that question in the first place. We restored the right to vote, recognizing that it had been taken away in the criminal context, predominantly because the powers that be didn't want Black people to vote. And so recognizing what those policies were and then backing off of those are ways in which that we can continue to see progress in undermining and unraveling the systemic racism that's part of this. So thanks again for highlighting that. Those are some examples of what we can do. And again, it doesn't happen overnight. And a lot of times it's not just one person who gets to make the decision on how to change it. You have to convince half of the legislature and then the governor to sign the bill and then people to enforce it. So it's going to take time, but that's what you have to do is recognize it and then begin to implement plans and policies that undo what we see as remnants of the discriminatory practices that predate even the existence of our country.
There's so many different pieces across the board that we have to address one at a time. Like it's not going to happen overnight, but it has to happen. And we just have to start. This is the first time I've thought about a lot of the things that we're talking about today. We've got the gumption that
Right.
we're going to stick with this and we're going to make those changes. And it's going to take a while, but we're going to stick with it every day. And some of the changes we make might not work,
Right.
but that doesn't mean we give up and
Yeah.
we stop or throw as we talk about, throw the baby out with the bathwater. We tweak and we continue to work towards our ultimate goal.
The problems are dynamic, and it's going to take dynamic solutions. I don't think we work on them one at a time, though. I think we work on these simultaneously. As many of those problems that we can find, we begin to address. Some will be addressed quicker than others. Some will probably won't be addressed in our generation, right? Or we won't at least see the manifestation of the success in our generation. But we continue to, that effort on a going forward basis. And we have to do it, recognizing that it is systemic, and we have a duty to try to level the playing field.
Going back to how can we get involved? What can we do? I know for me, attending the Black Lives Matter rallies have been educational for me. It doesn't necessarily mean that everyone feels comfortable going to those, but you've got to find ways to communicate and have conversations. I feel in having this conversation with you today, just how much I've learned about what we can do, how much I've learned about where the state is in regards to policing and in regards to what we want to see with changes that were made. I felt extremely confident talking with Sheriff Balaam, who had already talked to us that these changes were being implemented before George Floyd had been killed. And I think that it's important that we continue to educate ourselves about different cultures and understand that we're all coming at things in a different way. I am not going to approach the things the way you would as a Black man. I've never been in your shoes, but I vitally appreciate and want to continue to hear your story and the stories of other African Americans and other cultures and other nationalities so that I can do better myself. We will never forget George Floyd, and the best thing that we can do is to continue to educate ourselves about the things that we may have misunderstood in the past.
Great comments there. And I want to build on something you said a minute ago about you going to Black Lives Matter protests and others not necessarily, wanting to do that. And that's perfectly fine. One of the things that I've tried to impress upon others is that people don't have to serve in the way that you do in order to serve. There are so many different ways that you can participate, that you can offer solutions to the issues. And, Connie, what you decide to do is potentially influencing your own circle, which is what we need allies to do. And you don't have to do exactly what I do. I'm a politician who you will not see marching in the protest right now. Not because I don't believe in the protests, but because as a top law enforcement officer in the state, I can't be condoning gatherings of 50 or more because the governor has a directive that says you shouldn't be doing it, right? But that doesn't mean I'm not operating in my own sphere of influence right now to ensure that I can promulgate and perpetuate solutions to the issues. And part of what we do is ensure that our leadership, once we are leaders, is that we implement policies and enforce those as well. And so one of the first things I did when I became Attorney General was to create and begin enforcing a criminal justice reform policy that talked about the way that my prosecutors engaged with defendants on sentencing issues, ensuring that we didn't stack sentences, for example, recognizing that would be something that contributes to the problem. And so looking for ways to get engaged however you can. Sometimes people can just donate money. Sometimes people have to donate time. Sometimes people just have a conversation. Sometimes we have media professionals like you all who can have these types of things and spread the word. And that's perfectly fine, and that's great, and that's appropriate. So, kudos to you, Connie, for engaging, and and I just want to communicate again directly to the viewing audience that you don't have to do anything that we're doing right here, but do something. And the last thing I'll say is this: do it anyway. And what do I mean by that? There are people, as a politician, it's not part of my job description, but people think that they can do it. They call me anything but the child of God, right? They call me, they taunt me, they send me nasty tweets, they call me everything again but the child of God. And thinking that I'm made of Velcro and that I have no emotions about it, that I won't have a visceral reaction, or that I won't want to respond. Now, to be sure, I have thick skin, and you don't hurt my feelings like that. But recognizing that police officers receive the same type of treatment oftentimes by folks in our communities. Recognize that there's nothing wrong with being nice. I mean, there's nothing wrong with engaging with police officers in a cordial basis. Yeah, you got the right to say what you want to say, but do you have to say it? And at the end of the day, the cop is going to be held to a higher standard. To be sure, he cannot just well off and hit you because you call him a bad word. But that doesn't mean you got to call him a bad word. And so I would encourage everyone to continue to treat others as you want to be treated, and hopefully that's nicely. And then maybe that's also a way that we can improve relations between law enforcement and the communities that we serve.
I am just so thrilled about today's episode. It's just been so empowering, and I really hope that if you're watching, that you share this. I think what you said is so poignant in the fact that it can just start with a small conversation within your group of people that you spend time with. Having those conversations. I know how I am seeing things differently in these last few months in ways that and I even had this conversation with Diaz the other day. I said, well, Diaz, I'm realizing all this time, I'm not a racist, but it's more than that. And, we kind of laughed about it. And I said, it's just not enough for me to just say I'm not racist. And he was like, that's right, Connie, you can do more.
That's right. You have to be anti-racist.
Yes.
That's the key. Not just being not racist, but being anti-racist. And when people in your circle say, insensitive remarks, racist remarks, call them on it. When you see injustices taking place that are race-based, deal with it. Be anti-racist. And that's part of the way that we can also continue moving forward.
Attorney General, thank you so very much for taking the time to speak with us today. And before we wrap, I would wonder if you could maybe elaborate a little more. If there are people that are watching who think, well, look, I want some tools. How do I tackle racism? How do I get better at that? I mean, if there's an anti-racism 101 class, I want to take that class. What are some ways? Is it about finding an organization to get involved with? Is it about maybe holding, breakfast meetings where you have and invite an African American to come speak to your group? What are some small ways that we can tackle racism right here, right now?
Some of these are going to sound elementary, but they're true, and people don't really do it. One of the ways is just to expand your circle. Include in your circle people of different backgrounds, of different races, of different regions and creeds and whatnot. Expand it and have conversations with folks and engage in conversation around their experiences. Again, to move from a point of ignorance to a point of intentionality on the positive side, where you can try to positively affect the interactions that we have on a race-based issue, right? I do think there are organizations, obviously, out there that advocate for equality. Obviously, the NAACP, LULAC, AAPI organizations that are focused on particular segments of our population that I think also provide good information and opportunities for outreach into particular communities that you should capitalize on. And then finally, I'd say just do some self-education. Education has always been used to indoctrinate. And the last example I give, I know you have to wrap it up, but this is what I'm talking about, recognizing that education has always been used to indoctrinate. I'll never forget when my now 27-year-old was in the 7th grade in Texas, taking a multiple choice exam that was administered by the state to require him to pass to the next grade. A question was, what was the cause of the Civil War? 4 answers there, 2 of which he got rid of, process of elimination. The last 2 answers, though, were the ones that were correct. One of the answers was slavery, and the other was states' rights. And obviously, according to Texas, the answer was states' rights. And I was livid. And I'm thinking to myself, first off, it was the state's right to own slaves. And so the more appropriate answer would be slavery. But in any event, it's no wonder that people oftentimes say that Black people are hypersensitive when it comes to race, when a test question can't even acknowledge that the most racist institution that our country has existed under was the cause of the Civil War. And so recognizing that education has been used to indoctrinate means that you have to educate yourself sometimes and read additional books. Read, for example, Michelle Alexander's book called The New Jim Crow, that talks about the prison industrial complex and the integration, if you will, of other forms of systemic racism that persist because of that. Read Ta-Nehisi Coates' books. Read Dog Whistle Politics so that you can understand in our political system how racism continues to exist, from dog whistles against candidates to outright undermining of actual elected officials. These are ways that you can educate yourself to augment your understanding of race-based issues and to hopefully move us forward in trying to eradicate racism in our society.
Thank you so very much. Attorney General Aaron Ford has taken the time to talk with us today. Talk It Out Tuesday, creating change between law enforcement and the community. Again, Attorney General, we greatly appreciate you taking your time, and also to Crisis Support Services of Nevada for putting on Talk It Out Tuesday. Crisis Support Services of Nevada is a charitable organization. It is a nonprofit organization that is helping all Nevadans as well as people across our nation. This is a challenging time, and we need Crisis Support Services. We need you to support the work that they're doing. So if you can, we ask that you do make a donation, and you can do so by visiting their website at cssnv.org. And like Rachelle said, it doesn't matter what the crisis is, it is a crisis to you, and Crisis Support Services is there for you 24/7. You can contact them by calling 1-800-273-8255. You can also text CARE to 839-863, and again, the website, cssnv.org. Thank you both so very much. We greatly appreciate it, and thank you all for joining us for Talk It Out Tuesday.
Thank you.